Good afternoon. You're listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas, gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today is, what is wrong with my system? July the 14th. Yesterday was the one-year anniversary since the attempt to assassinate President Trump by Thomas Crooks. That's quite an interesting story in and of itself. Now, this is the 195th day of the year. Only 170 days remain to the year's over with. Holidays and observances. It's National Mac and Cheese Day. Shark Awareness Day. Tackle the stigma and raise awareness about the reality of sharks. They're interesting creatures. They keep the ocean ecosystem running, and in spite of rumors to the contrary, rarely do they attack humans. It's World Chimpanzee Day, National Grand Marnier Day, National Non-Binary People Day. If they don't have enough times to celebrate, they got another one now. Emmeline Pankhurst Day. If you're not familiar with her, she was one of the UK's most famous suffragettes. She's one of the reasons that women have the right to vote. National Tape Measure Day. National Nude Day. Let it all hang out. National Break Free from the Big Three Day. National Be Nice to Bugs Day. Pandemonium Day, where you get to free yourself from the stuffiness of ordinary life and let pandemonium reign. International Town Criers Day. You know, before modern technology, when most folks couldn't read, town criers kept people up to date on current events and what was going on. You'd see somebody running up and down the street screaming about whatever was happening. Bastille Day. It's France's national holiday. It's celebrated with fireworks and parades and a whole lot of French culture and history. Then we got the Drina Regatta, which starts today and goes on to the 20th. It's a unique event held annually on the Drina River in Syria. It's known as one of the largest and most popular water-based festivities in the region. Thousands of visitors come to enjoy a unique blend of tradition and entertainment. You know, the highlight of the regatta is the massive non-competitive river descent. You also get music and dance and delicious local food. Fiesta de la Triana, Galway International Arts Festival. It starts today and goes on through the 27th. It's a celebration of creativity that takes place in the city of Galway. It brings together artists and performers and visitors from around the globe for 2 weeks of music and theater and dance and visual arts and even more. The festival transforms Galway into a hub of cultural activity. Events taking place in various venues, from theaters to public squares. It's a unique opportunity to experience both Irish and international art in an enchanting medieval city, attracting over 400,000 attendees every year. It's Rabbit Week. Somebody asked me what that was. And it's an event that raises awareness about rabbit well-being and encourages everybody to understand the needs of these beloved pets. Raises awareness about proper rabbit care. Emphasizes rabbits are more than cute, furry creatures. They require specific environments and specific diets and medical care in order to thrive. I had somebody gave me a couple years ago and built a little cage for him. Next thing I know, I had 8. Tour de France goes on. It started the 5th of July and goes on through the 27th. Famous people born on this date. Gerald Ford, Mr. Tell Me What to Say and I'll Say It. His reward for his part of the Warren Commission, he became president. All right, let's talk about what's in the news today. A fire in an assisted living facility killed 9, sent dozens to the hospital. It was a deadly overnight blaze in Massachusetts, an assisted living home. Residents are heard screaming for help as 50 firefighters battered the overnight inferno at Gabriel House. They were called to the assisted living facility about 9:50 p.m. They put the fire out by this morning. First responders rushed in to try to save folks. Over 30 people were taken to the hospital. One individual remains in critical condition. This took place in Fall River, Massachusetts. About 70 people resided at the assisted living facility. They don't yet know, or at least they're not saying, what the cause of the fire was. Well, Trump has blasted Putin's actions in regard to Ukraine, and we have sent some new weapons to Ukraine. Now, apparently, Zelensky expects us to foot the bill for the whole thing without him having to worry about where the money's going to come from. I think that's going to come to a screeching halt shortly. Now, AOC is continuing to literally insult President Trump. And there's a movement afoot to have her sued just like Paramount was. Well, ICE is deporting 122 Chinese nationals. There was a Chinese immigrant surge during the Biden administration, which frankly is a national security concern. A lot of them who said they had nothing suddenly had the money to buy land near close to military bases. One border security expert said the massive number of Chinese illegal immigrants who crossed the border during the Biden administration is certainly a national security concern. But as I say, 122 were deported, many of whom are convicted of murder and drug trafficking and rape and human smuggling. Officials said the individuals were taken to China on a special high-risk charter flight. Department of Justice on Tuesday charged 7 Chinese nationals after they allegedly operated a multi-million-dollar marijuana trafficking ring. According to the Justice Department, they smuggled illegal immigrants through the U.S.-Mexico border to work in marijuana grow houses. Kind of like the kids that turned up at the marijuana farm in California. Well, the individual involved in shooting the folks at the Kentucky church, investigation shows he had connections to church victims. He did have a connection, but they're searching for a motive. Gunman shot and killed 2 women at a church on Sunday, injured a state trooper. The suspect, who police haven't yet named, in addition to killing the 2 women, injured 2 men at the Richmond Road Baptist Church in Lexington, Kentucky. Opened fire at a state trooper after he was pulled over near the Bluegrass Airport about 11:30 in the morning. Officers suspected to survive. Suspect was pulled over after the state trooper's license plate reader showed there was an alert on that particular tag. With some people en route to the airport, they got out and helped the trooper. The church is 16 miles from where the state trooper was shot. Nobody seems to know why he did what he did, but he did it. Well, blue city officers are flocking to cop-friendly red states, and police leaders in the Democratic-run cities are saying, why would anybody stay? Fraternal Order Police Vice President revealed law enforcement is abandoning Democratic-run areas for what they call the greener pastures. Joe Grimaldi is the National Vice President of Fraternal Order Police. He's an active lieutenant with the Houston Police Department. And he said police in blue cities are getting tired of facing hostilities from their own local leaders. And certainly, that is understandable. You know, people want to feel appreciated for what they do. When you've got a boss, in this case, for example, the mayor of Los Angeles, or members of city council who call you a piece of crap to the public, why would you stay? Now, former CNN commentator has a gut feeling Republicans cheated in 2024 are going to cheat in 2026. That's Angela Rye, a former CNN commentator. She has a podcast called Native Land Pod where she talks about the fact she thinks the Republicans cheated in 2024. Well, we know the Democrats cheated in 2020. They pretty much admitted that. Now, let's see. Newsom and Vance exchanged jabs over immigration after the vice president's California vacation. Vance was spending time at the amusement park with his wife Lucia and their 2 children. Before Newsom, the Democrat, posted on social media some migrant families can't spend the same quality time together because of the administration's efforts to remove them from the country. You know, what the Democrats fail to understand, if you break the law to come here, there are repercussions. And Newsom doesn't seem to understand it. He thinks he's the president. Well, there's a dangerous payment trend that experts are expressing concern about. It's the credit catastrophe that could wreck your credit score in 2025. They're cautioning against financing everything from getting a pizza delivered to, you know, this buy now, pay later revolution is taking the American economy by storm. And eventually, you're going to have to pay the piper. Well, there's more river flooding. You know, part of the problem seems to be been a lot of heavy rains. And the system's just not designed for the amount that we've had. Well, Mamdani, who is the socialist winner of the, you talk about cheating, of the primary in New York City for mayor, continues to push his absolutely crazy ideas. He wants to tax the whites and give everybody else a pass. New York City's leading CEOs who employ thousands at some of the world's biggest companies, such as JP Morgan and Pfizer, didn't expect to be sweating it out at a meeting with Mamdani in the middle of July. But they were. Well, the historic Grand Canyon Lodge has been destroyed in a wildfire. It's closed the north rim for the season. Now, there were no injuries reported. The visitors evacuated safely before the flames engulfed the building. Flames from the Dragon Bravo fire engulfed the lodge. The visitor center, the gas station, the wastewater treatment plant, the administrative offices, employee housing. That's according to Park Superintendent Ed Keeble. National Park Service estimates they had about 50 to 80 structures destroyed. No injuries, as I say. All staff and residents cleared the area before the fire advanced. They believe lightning sparked the Dragon Bravo fire on July 4th. Authorities initially managed the fire with a confine and contain strategy. But amid scorching heat, low humidity, and high winds, officials shifted to try to fully suppress the fire. It scorched 7.8 square miles thus far. And the Grand Canyon Lodge, the only lodging on the North Rim, was a landmark known for its sloped roof and massive ponderosa beams and limestone facade. When you approach the canyon, that's the first thing most folks see. Now, a Air Force veteran has undergone the process of becoming a two-time living organ donor. There are certain organs you can donate while alive and still continue to go. California pastor John MacArthur hospitalized with life-threatening illnesses as the church community rallies behind it. He's 86 years old. He's the spiritual leader of the Grace Community Church. And he's going to be in the presence of the Lord soon, is what they're saying. He contracted pneumonia, according to Associate Pastor Tom Patton, admitted to the hospital. He previously made national headlines after a California judge ruled he could continue holding in-person services despite his lordship, Gavin Newsom's statewide coronavirus restrictions. In fact, he had a sudden onset of illness during a 2023 church service and undergone numerous surgeries to treat atrial fibrillation and other conditions. Well, there's still tension at the DOJ regarding the Epstein materials. You know, quite frankly, I think that's a tempest in a teapot, but that's just me. Well, one state is fighting against classroom indoctrination. It's targeted the woke welcome signs. Idaho. A teacher displayed a sign in her classroom that said everybody's welcome here. Now, that would appear to be a neutral message, but the design reveals its true purpose. The colorful letters above the imagery designed to signal adherence to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Rainbow colors and progressive symbols. These classroom displays reflect a broader ecosystem of what's called political resistance groups launched in protest and political rise of President Trump. The All Welcome Here movement, founded in November 2016 by activists in Minnesota, explicitly stated its mission is a just, inclusive, equitable environment. John Elway, learning his fate, he was driving when golf cart when his agent fell from the golf cart. Now, Elway's going to avoid charges in the death of his agent, Jeff Spurbeck. Died in April from injuries sustained in a golf cart crash. The Riverside County, California Sheriff Chad Bianco told Channel 9 News in Denver that the crash was nothing more than a tragic accident, and they've completed their investigation. Well, you know, have you ever known anybody who's always late? Well, it turns out that is possibly a mental health condition. Time blindness is what that's being called now. It's behind being chronically late. Well, a German company's unveiled vertical tiny homes, 3 stories, prefabricated residence. Get downsizing a high-rise lift. $176,000 for a 3-story tiny home that fits in your backyard. Well, on that note, I got a strange story for you today. Everybody's familiar with the Bay of Pigs, which was basically a debacle. The Cuban exiles that we trained and armed attempted to invade Cuba, and they were basically wiped out. Now, that upset a lot of the military, our military. And there's a number of issues regarding Cuba. You know, Castro, who overthrew Batista, wanted support, but we didn't give it, so he turned to Russia. And basically, Cuba became a Soviet beachhead in the Western Hemisphere. So our military wanted to do something about it. But the president at the time was John Kennedy. And Kennedy was very susceptible to public opinion. That's the only way to put it. So, with that in mind, the military came up with a bizarre plan. It became known as Operation Northwoods, which was in effect a false flag plot. Now, the plan was devised, or at least pushed, by General Lyman Lemnitzer, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time. And he had a meeting with a lot of military leaders, and he gave them a 9-page document. And being a veteran of Vietnam, what this plan would do didn't faze him. A false flag plot is we attack our own ships, we attack our own cities, we shoot our own people, and blame whoever we want to go to war against. If you get the public behind the idea of going to war, the president can't stop it. And that was the idea behind Operation Northwoods. Now, according to Operation Northwoods, we would create the appearance of Cuban aggression, what we refer to as controlled incidents, which would cause civilian panic, a crisis that justifies action, in other words. And during the meeting, when this was proposed to the Joint Chiefs, somebody asked, what if people die? And the response was, they'll die if we don't do anything. Look at Khrushchev. Look at the missiles. Castro's not just a nuisance. He's a beachhead for the Soviets. If we don't act, we hand them the hemisphere. Another view of it, it's not a question of ethics, it's a question of optics. We make it look like they fired the first shot. Well, the issue was raised during that meeting that opposing false flag operations on American soil isn't just controversial, it's also illegal. And Lemnitzer is said to have responded. You think legality stops Moscow? You think morality keeps Castro awake at night? Well, he made the point, we're not talking about indiscriminate terror. We're talking about narrative control. And to get a major victory, you have to be willing to sacrifice. Well, this meeting took place in March of 1962. Cuban Missile Crisis hadn't yet broken out into the headlines, but Pentagon knew about it. And for the folks considering Operation Northwoods, the Cold War wasn't a metaphor. It was, I guess you could say, a calculation. Now, outside that meeting room, the world went along in blissful ignorance. American families had dinner every evening, sat in front of the TV. And I still remember in school, it was insisted we practice duck and cover drills because everybody was sure the Russians were going to bomb us. Well, in that particular meeting, it was quite clear that by the time Lunitzer finished his briefing, he had everybody on his side. They laid out a dozen options in that meeting: plane hijacking, ship sinkings, orchestrated funerals, even faking the death of astronauts to make it look like the Russians had just gone on a killing spree. And of course, this was a highly classified meeting. Now, it was suggested they use civilian actors as the victims. Lunitzer said, nope, we need real civilians. And the question was, what do we tell the press? And the response was, we don't tell them anything. We let the American people do what they always do. Believe what's in front of them. Because some talking head is going to say, it's the Russians, we got to do something, and everybody's going to go, yep, you're right, it's the Russians. Proposed in that 9-page document was simulated sabotage, mortality acceptability thresholds, all the bureaucratic words that cover up what we're talking about here. They even proposed bombing a bus. And Lunitzer's plan was, if the operation goes forward, we deliver Castro on a platter. We give the president what he's too cautious to take. We secure the hemisphere for the future. Now, there were a few holdouts. One officer is said to have, this was all put together long after the fact by people who had been there. One officer said this is not strategy. And it's true, it wasn't strategy. It was, you might refer to it as a ritual. Now, the first option was, I guess you could say, elegant in its simplicity. The passenger plane would take off from Miami, scheduled flight, going to Central America, and according to the manifest, it would carry college students and missionaries, ordinary Americans heading to volunteer projects abroad, trying to do the right thing. In reality, that plane would be empty, save for a handful of government operatives disguised as civilians. Halfway through the flight, the pilot would transmit a Mayday signal. They claimed Cuban fighters were swimming around the aircraft, and then there'd be silence. And then the plane would vanish from radar, supposedly shot down in international waters. Now, a second identical plane, painted and numbered to match the first one, would land quietly at a secure military airstrip. The crew would vanish, records never be found. And then across the country, grief would blossom in front of flickering TVs. Mothers would cry, flags would be lowered, Cuba would be blamed. This might be referred to as a ghost flight, built for mourning. And there's one of several. Another memo proposed detonating explosive inside a Navy vessel docked at Guantanamo Bay. That blast would occur during a training drill, ensuring the crew had plausible reason to be caught off guard. That explosion would kill a dozen servicemen, maybe more. Be enough shrapnel and bodies and fire to make sure there'd be televised outrage. Walter Cronkite would be screaming from the rooftops. They even had headlines ready for the media. Cuban aggressors strike again. Another plan called for fake terror campaigns across major cities, Washington, D.C., Miami, even Los Angeles. Agents would stage bombings in shopping malls and public squares using incendiary devices put into trash cans and lockers. It'd be very real injuries, no question about it. It'd be very real funerals. But the stories behind these events would be fiction. According to what the media would say, Cuban operatives aided by the Soviets were striking at the heart of the free world. And among the notes scrawled on one page of this proposal, it's essential to maintain believable Cuban fingerprints. Now, at Langley, there was a man named Arthur Mason, logistics officer, had the temporary assignment of coordinating resources. Now, at one point in time, he'd been assigned to manage food shipments into Berlin during the blockade, but this was somewhat different. He was given a list of requests: untraceable arms, forged IDs, blank passports. And it became clear to him that this was not hypothetical. This was a very real program. And almost before he could finish reading the document, he got a request for a delivery schedule. One morning he walked into a supervisor's office and said, "Are we actually going to do this?" And he was told, "We're preparing options." Well, options became policy with the stroke of a pen. And anything proposed by the government, they got to the level of asking for options, was going to take place. And every detail of Operation Northwoods was refined with clinical detachment. If a civilian plane was hijacked, the agents would carry real passports. If a student protest was needed, actors would be hired from military theater divisions. If a martyr was required, a hero to die on live TV, they actually had volunteers ready to do that, for the good of the country, of course. There was even a proposal to blow up John Glenn's rocket. Now, one of the subfolders that was found long after the event, there was a memo titled "Suggestions for Heightened Emotional Impact." And in it was written exploding a U.S. launch vehicle in flight. That would galvanize support if attributed to external sabotage. And it specifically referenced John Glynn's mission into space. Now, this memo wasn't signed, but it was not removed either. Now, among those reviewing the documents was the Defense Department official named Ruth Bennett. One of the few civilians had clearance at this level, brought in for her background in counterintelligence and psychological operations. She read about propaganda in textbooks, taught the history of psychological warfare to students. But this was beyond the theoretical. She was looking at the proposal for staging funerals with actors complete with weeping widows and sobbing children. In one meeting, she made the comment, this is theater. We're scripting national grief. And the response was, now you get the point. And it was the same justification every time anything was said. Castro's a threat. The Soviets are encroaching. American people needed to be united. And unity has a price. In the internal memos that survived, you found words like expendable and fabricated and acceptable losses. Now, this stilted language, of course, dulled the brutality of the intent, cloaked it in professionalism. But at the bottom line, at the end of the day, there was one single inescapable truth. The United States government was planning to hurt its own people, not by accident, not by negligence, but by design. At one point, it was suggested creating a fake martyr within the military. A well-liked Hispanic officer with a made-up Cuban cousin who could be connected to the attack. Personal histories were drafted, photographs were selected, family was invented. He didn't exist, but his funeral was already on the storyboard. Well, by early April, plans were assembled into a formal presentation for presidential review. The dossier was thick. Separate envelope contained suggested media angles, complete with draft newspaper headlines, tailored statements for cabinet members, and outlines for a televised speech for the Oval Office. Final page had the signatures of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The military was fully behind this program. And at the bottom, in blue ink, was General Limnitzer's mark, clean and proud. This was his baby. Envelope was sealed. It was delivered to the West Wing. Now, while it wasn't mentioned by anybody, it was very clear they'd crossed a line. Not with the plan itself, but with their willingness to normalize it. They weren't plotting a deception as much as they were redefining the nation they served. Well, it was April of 1962 when Kennedy opened that folder. His advisor sat nearby, each waiting for a flicker reaction on his face. But a lot of folks have said John Kennedy was hard to read when he wanted to be. Slowly he read page by page, and finally he looked up and said, "Who the hell thought this was acceptable?" George Bundy, one of Kennedy's top advisors, said it came from the Joint Chiefs, General Limnitzer's team. And Kennedy looked at him and he said, "You mean to tell me the highest ranking officers in the United States military sat around a table and suggested we fake terrorist attacks on our own soil? Bomb buses, hijack planes, murder our own people, and blame it on Cuba?" Well, Bundy cleared his throat and said, "Well, Mr. President, And Kennedy stopped him and he said, I read it. I read all of it. He said, I want to know if any of you actually consider bringing this to me as a viable option. And nobody said a word. He said, this is not who we are. You tell Limnitzer this plan dies here. Rejection of this proposal was immediate, unambiguous, irreversible. When Limnitzer was informed, he didn't say a word. He just nodded, folded the briefing paper he had in his hand, and walked out of the office. A few months later, Kennedy replaced him as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And Operation Northwoods was buried in a classified vault at the Pentagon. Classified and sealed away under the pretext of national security. And it stayed hidden for almost 40 years. But unfortunately, the idea lingered, not in execution, but in possibility. The men who had come up with the plan returned to their duties. Some were reassigned, some were retired with honors, and nobody was prosecuted. Nobody apologized. In their minds, they'd done what was necessary. They designed scenarios to provoke a reluctant public into a war. They didn't see it as treason, they saw it as strategy. And that's what made it worse. Well, it stayed hidden until 1997, when journalist James Bamford filed a request under the Freedom of Information Act. Among thousands of released pages, he found a 9-page document stamped top secret. It outlined the government plot to stage false flag attacks against Americans in order to justify going to war with Cuba. Now, the Bay of Pigs used Cuban exiles. They flew the Cuban flag. The plan was to get the United States military into this war using Operation Northwoods. Well, when he wrote about it, the American public was stunned. Most people refused to believe it. Others saw it as validation of every suspicion they ever had about the government. Conspiracy theorists waved that document over their heads, and they grabbed onto it like it was scripture. Political commentators ranted and raved. Senators demanded explanations. But the architects of the plan were long gone. The answers that were given were, if at all, were merely whispers. Nobody got punished. And because it had never been carried out, no crime had technically been committed. Now, the damage wasn't in the execution of the plan. It was in the revelation the plan existed. Northwoods confirmed the unimaginable had been imagined. Behind the suits and symbols of national power were men willing to orchestrate fear and death and deception for the sake of policy. That document became a kind of artifact, a skeleton key for the paranoid, a case study for historians, a warning for the idealistic. In years that followed, the revelation, references to Northwoods surfaced whenever tragedy struck. When a plane went down, when a building collapsed, and I refer you to 9/11, when a war began, there was always a question. Usually never spoken aloud, but the question was there anyway. Was this real or was it scripted? Didn't matter if the plan was killed. The fact it was ever written was enough to put that idea in the minds of a lot of people. Inside intelligence circles, the name Northwoods became shorthand for that line that should never be crossed. Now, others weren't so sure. In private think tanks and closed meetings and black budget corridors, ideas like that still get whispered. Always with plausible deniability. Always with patriotic framing. It's never called evil. It's called contingency. Now today, the phrase false flag carries the weight of 1,000 conspiracy theories, I guess you could say. It's become something of a poison term, used recklessly by grifters and paranoiacs. But beneath the noise is a single truth, cold, hard, unforgiving. Once at the height of American power, the most trusted men in uniform sat around a table and plotted how to make their own citizens bleed. The plan was stopped. The problem is the door was opened. And some doors, once opened, never quite get closed again. And did Kennedy give him the go-ahead for that? Who knows what kind of world we'd be living in right now? But that was the famous Operation Northwoods. I wrote a book about it. You can find it at, if you go to Amazon, look up Ken Hudnall under Kindle, you'll find Operation Northwoods. It's a fascinating book. And it goes into things that absolutely blow your mind. Well, the next, to my way of thinking, reprehensible program designed by the government became known as Operation Paperclip. It brought numerous, over 1,600 that we know of, Nazi scientists into America. They weren't rescued from a collapsing society, they were recruited. Now, the war had barely ended. It ended in April of 1945 in Europe. But in May of 1945, while the ruins of Germany still smoldered and the cities collapsed into skeletons, bridges collapsed, train tracks twisted like nerves, the Third Reich had fallen, no question about it. But even as the swastikas were torn down, something else was already underway. In the foothills of Bavaria, a convoy of unmarked military trucks wound its way through the narrow switchbacks near Obermargu. Wheel of the lead jip was Colonel Holger Toftoy, U.S. Army Ordnance. He didn't come to arrest war criminals. He didn't come to liberate concentration camps. In actuality, he came to shop. What he sought lay not in the gold bars of Nazi vaults or hidden bunkers of SS archives, but in German minds, rocket scientists, chemists, physicists, men who had powered the Nazi war machine with formulas and fuel, even built the V-2s that reduced London to rubble. These men had knowledge, and America wanted it. America needed it. Well, it was in one of the abandoned barracks outside of Nordhausen where Toftoy's men found the man they were looking for. Werner von Braun, 33 years old, described as tall and elegant in posture. His arm was in a sling from a recent car crash. He made no attempt to evade. In fact, he surrendered easily, even politely. When he was asked the all-important question, would he be willing to work for the United States, he smiled and said, "We speak the same language." Now, that was all the paperwork Toftoy needed. He had his man. Now, the Soviets were moving west at the same time, seizing towns, dismantling factories, interrogating scientists. The Cold War hadn't begun yet. We were still allies. But everybody in the intelligence community knew it was coming. The alliance that won World War II was dead. Germany, broken and gutted, was now the battleground of a different kind. What about territory anymore? It was about brains. The orders given in the U.S. zone were very clear. Find the talent. Get them out. Don't ask too many questions. And the men they gathered weren't just scientists. Oh, no. A lot of them were full members of the Nazi Party. Some were members of the SS. The others designed the very rockets used to terrorize civilians. Names have been written in documents retrieved from Peenemünde, Dora Mittelbau, and the Ahnenerbe archives. Under existing law, Those enemies of this country should never have been brought here. They should have been prosecuted. With the stroke of a pen, for the greater good, we were told, those records began to disappear. Initially, it was called Operation Overcast. Later on, it became known as Operation Paperclip. Now, a number of people have asked me where that name came from. And the name came from the paperclips attached to select personnel files. Those files that had been chosen to be cleaned before being shown to immigration authorities. Files marked with the clip had references to Nazism deleted or softened. Scientists would be rebranded not as former enemies, but as assets, technical experts helping the free world stand against communism. Even in Washington, the debate was minimal. Few State Department lawyers were not happy about it. One Army investigator reported that von Braun's team had used slave labor at the Middlework facility where prisoners from Buchenwald died by the thousands, crushed under collapsing tunnels or executed when too weak to work. Well, the response from the War Department said this is not a matter of justice, it's a matter of national security. So the planes full of former Nazis began to arrive. Dozens of German scientists landed quietly on American soil between 1945 and 1952. There were no announcements, no press. The Fourth Estate turned a blind eye. They were taken to isolated military bases in Texas, New Mexico, and Alabama, given false identities. Some used their real names but were carefully curated biographies. Werner von Braun came here to Fort Bliss. Later he went to Huntsville. And he helped build the backbone of the American missile program. He would shake hands with generals and be photographed for Life magazine. Eventually helped put a man on the moon. In spite of the fact that back in Europe, there were still tunnels full of corpses. One American soldier stationed near Nordhausen after the liberation wrote home to his wife, "Scientists walk free and eat steak. Prisoners are buried in mass graves. Nobody talks about the smell." In the silence of post-war Reconstruction, some truths were buried. Buried under the roar of rockets and the red thread of communism. Buried under medals and flags and ambitions that reach beyond the atmosphere. But not everyone forgot. Now, the desert in New Mexico was like anything the Germans had seen. Flat, bleached, endless. At night, the wind carries a cold so sharp it cut through military-issued wool. During the day, the sun blisters the ground till it cracks. But the Germans adapted. White sands proving ground in front of von Braun stood beside American officers watching test rockets pierce the sky in long trembling arcs. He took notes in English now. He actually spoke it fluently. Wore civilian clothes with tailored precision. The swastika pen that once gleamed on his lapel was gone. Replaced by a gold wristwatch given to him by a an American general. He was a charming man. Always had been. His men adored him. His new colleagues admired him. But whenever he was asked about his past, he'd laugh and say, "We were all just engineers. Politics was never my concern." And for the most part, people believed him. Actually, they wanted to believe it. America needed a narrative. And von Braun gave him one. Redemption through science. Enemy repurposed. The genius salvaged. The old world cleansed through technological promise. He became a media figure. A Cold War trophy. By the late 1950s, he was the face of American rocketry. He even went on Walt Disney's televised specials explaining the future of space travel. Luckily, nobody asked about Dora. Dora Midabout, been buried in a weight of euphemism and strategic omissions. But the records were still there, scattered across military archives and the testimonies of those who had survived its tunnels. The Middleburg complex was where the V-2 rocket had been assembled, deep underground, away from Allied bombers. It's also where thousands of prisoners, many from Buchenwald, worked until their bodies collapsed. They worked in never-ending shifts, died of exhaustion, tuberculosis, beatings, hung by piano wires, warnings. Bones were mixed with the soil, ground into the concrete of the Reich's dying breath. Among those bodies walked the engineers, von Braun among them. French survivor named Jean-Michel later testified he came to inspect the machinery. He stepped over the bodies, never looked down, never made any reference to them. But in Huntsville, Alabama, past was a shadow that had no teeth. The town actually embraced him. Newspapers called him Dr. Space. His team, which had been brought over through Paperclip, helped design the Redstone missile and the Jupiter C. When Sputnik beeped across American skies in 1957, it was von Braun who was called upon to answer. His rockets carried America back to the forefront. 1960, the uniformed NASA absorbed his team. He became director of the Marshall Space Flight Center. He designed the Saturn V, or the Saturn V. He was America's bridge to the stars. But in all this excitement, cracks were forming. By the mid-1960s, documents began to surface. Inquiries were made. Young journalists, skeptical of the myth, started digging into the Paperclip files. Some files have been sealed. Some have been redacted, but the redaction had been, shall we say, clumsy. References to SS affiliation, Nazi Party membership, letters of ideological enthusiasm, all erased with the quiet incompetence of a rush forgery. Then came the exposés. Found in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Der Spiegel. NASA hero linked to slave labor facility. From Dachau to the moon, the hidden lives of Americans, German scientists. Public reaction, of course, was fractured. Some demanded resignations, others said, oh, so what? Few insisted it didn't matter. After all, we beat the Soviets to the moon. But among the survivors, rage was fresh. 1969, as millions of Americans watched Neil Armstrong step onto the lunar dust, a Polish man named Marek Karol sat alone in a Brooklyn apartment with the TV turned off. He lost 3 fingers in Dora. He still had nightmares about the tunnels. When his grandson asked why he wouldn't watch history being made, he said, I was already saw it being built with blood. At a Senate hearing in 1973, a quiet bureaucrat from the Office of Special Investigations read from an internal Army memo written in 1947. It said very clearly, subject von Braun is security risk due to ideological alignment with National Socialist principles and proximity to slave labor facilities. Recommend exclusion from permanent resettlement. Committee chairman asked why was this memo ignored, and the response, because science won. Well, Werner von Braun died in Alexandria, Virginia in 1977, 65 years old. His obituary in the New York Times called him the architect of the American space program. No mention of Dora, no mention of Paperclip. The world already knew, and it didn't do any good at all. On that note, we come to the end of today's show. We'll be back tomorrow, and once again, you'll be listening to Ken Hudnall and the Ken Hudnall Show. Until then, have a truly great evening.